climate change. And lastly, we shall finish with what is arguably the biggest act of intergenerational theft, climate change. It's a problem we all have to face up to, or is it? No, climate change is overwhelmingly an intergenerational issue because climate change is predominantly the result of older generations creating an unsustainable carbon economy that burnt the world's finite fossil fuel resources, and it's the older generation who primarily benefited from that artificially cheap energy because they didn't pay the full environmental cost. Future generations will have to. If you're over 60, you realistically don't need to worry about climate change, as you will not be around to pay the financial price of climate change or have to deal with the consequences. In economic speak, older people have externalized the true cost of artificially cheap energy by passing on the cost to future generations. It is primarily the young who will have to pay the economic price for halting and or reversing climate change. One of the main reasons for failure to tackle climate change, of course, is the complete failure to limit consumption and control population growth, which has virtually doubled from 4 billion people in 1975 to 7.9 billion in 2022. So any attempt to reduce an individual's consumption by a few percent are utterly meaningless in this context. And of course, there are huge vested interests in a growing population, a growing pool of cheap labour, expanding consumer base, etc. And their entire economic model is predicated upon continual economic growth, something that Greta Thunberg rightly mocked in her speech, where she quoted fairy tales of eternal economic growth. So just like with the housing crisis, there is absolutely no political will to solve overpopulation. Businesses, politicians and many voters actively want high population growth because it results in rising living standards for them. So how much will it cost future generations to stop climate change and halt global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade? There's general consensus figure that it's around $50 trillion that needs to be spent globally over the next 30 years. But the world will still get 1.5 degrees centigrade warmer, even with that much investment. And that has economic consequences. Rising energy costs, extreme weather damage, food price rises, ice sheets melting and sea levels rising, loss of usable land, destruction of biodiversity and collapsing ecosystems. And these costs have been estimated at an additional $18 trillion over a 30-year period. But what's interesting from the point of view of this report is when exactly the world started warming. It started around 1945 post-World War II, exactly as the baby boomer generation were growing up, in an era of cheap fuel and reaping the benefits of massive rises in living standards. In short, we can confidently attribute the majority of climate change to the consumption pattern of the baby boomer generation, especially from the 1980s onwards. So, in total, the global impact of climate change will cost around $68 trillion globally. So let's assume that the UK accounts for around 3% of the global economy, and we will therefore have to pay a proportionate amount to mitigate climate change. This means that the UK will have to pay around $2.1 trillion to mitigate climate change. Now, of course, young people also consume food, goods, energy, also go on international flights, etc. But the reality is that their short time on the planet means that they have had a much smaller impact on the climate than an older person who has been a consumer for over 60 years or so. Therefore, we estimate that around 75% of climate change has been caused by consumption patterns of the older generation. Therefore, the intergenerational theft is in the order of 1.6 trillion times 0.75, around 1.2 trillion pounds. Don't forget to press like below and to subscribe to the YouTube channel Intergenerational Theft. And don't forget also that the full report is available to download for free from the website www.intergenerationaltheft.org. Thank you very much.